Long, long ago, Europe was not like the continent we know today. There were no bustling cities, no busy streets, no markets filled with voices and colors. Instead, there were vast forests, winding rivers, and small scattered villages. People lived close to the land. They hunted animals, fished in streams, gathered fruits, and told stories under the stars. Imagine a grandfather sitting by a fire, leaning on his cane, telling his grandchildren about the world as it once was. Back then, he might say, every forest had its secrets, every river its own story, and every hill a legend waiting to be discovered. Life was simple, but every day was a new adventure. People formed small tribes. Some were hunters, following the herds of deer and bison across the plains. Others were farmers, learning how to plant seeds and grow grains. Slowly, they discovered the power of community. Sharing food, protecting each other, and telling stories were the glue that held them together. And then came the first great civilizations. In the south, around the Mediterranean, people built cities, temples, and roads. They traded with distant lands, sharing ideas, goods, and even their gods. The Greeks and Romans left marks that would last for centuries. They taught Europe about politics, philosophy, art, and engineering. But life was never easy. Harsh winters, wild animals, and rival tribes tested the courage of every man and woman. They learned to adapt, to invent tools, to find clever ways to survive. And through these struggles, the seeds of modern Europe were planted, quietly, in the hearts and minds of its earliest people. As time went on, people started to build more than just shelters. They built villages with wooden houses, stone walls, and sometimes even early roads. These small communities were the first steps toward civilization. Families worked together, not just to survive, but to make life a little easier, a little brighter. The elders in the tribe were respected. They remembered the stories of the past, the lessons learned from hunters and farmers before them. Around the fire, children listened carefully, wide-eyed, as their grandparents described the mighty rivers, the towering mountains, and the endless forests. Every story was a lesson about courage, wisdom, and the importance of working together. In the southern parts of Europe, the Greeks started asking questions no one had dared to ask before. Who are we? Why is the world the way it is? What is right and wrong? Their philosophers walked through marketplaces, debating ideas with anyone who would listen. And slowly, the seeds of science, philosophy, and democracy were planted. Farther west and north, the Romans were rising. They built roads, aqueducts, and cities that connected the continent like never before. A traveler could walk from one end of the empire to the other, seeing soldiers, merchants, and artists along the way. Rome taught Europe about law, order, and how a society could organize itself on a massive scale. But outside the cities, life was still wild. Wolves prowled the forests. Storms could destroy a village in a night, and winters were long and harsh. People learned to adapt. They invented better tools, shared knowledge, and passed down traditions that would last for generations. Every challenge they faced made them stronger, smarter, and more connected to each other. Even as empires rose and fell, the ordinary people, the farmers, the hunters, the craftsmen, were the heartbeat of Europe. Their stories, struggles, and daily lives created the foundation upon which future generations would build. Life in ancient Europe was full of lessons, even in its smallest moments. People learned from the land. When the river flooded, they built higher houses. When the soil was poor, they found new ways to plant their crops. Every challenge was a teacher, every season a new chapter in their story. The tribes began to trade with each other. A village in the north might trade furs for grains from the south. Slowly, Europe became connected, even before the great roads of Rome. And with trade came ideas, beliefs, stories, and inventions traveled along with goods. A clever tool in one village could inspire a new way of life in another. Religion and spirituality were woven into everyday life. People saw the world as alive, full of spirits in rivers, trees, and mountains. Festivals celebrated the changing seasons, the sun, the harvest, and the cycles of life. Around the fire, songs and dances kept the past alive, honoring the ancestors who had walked the same paths centuries before. And then came the first great battles. Tribes fought to protect their homes, their families, and their honor. Courage was admired, but so was cleverness. Leaders emerged not just through strength, but by wisdom and fairness. The stories of these leaders became legends, passed down to children who would one day tell them by firelight. In these early days, Europe was a land of discovery. People discovered how to shape stone into tools, how to weave wool into clothing, how to sail rivers in boats made from trees. Each discovery made life richer, safer, and more connected. They didn't know they were building the foundations for the Europe we know today, but step by step, through daily life, struggles, and triumphs, they were shaping the future. As generations passed, communities grew larger and more organized. People learned to work together in new ways, building structures that would last longer than wood and mud. Stone walls surrounded villages, protecting them from wild animals and rival tribes. Fields were divided carefully, and crops were rotated to keep the soil rich. Life was still hard, but there was a rhythm to it, a sense of order that gave people hope for the future. Art and music began to flourish. Carvings in wood and stone told stories of heroes, gods, and great hunts. Songs were sung in the fields and around the fire, sometimes to celebrate a good harvest, sometimes to mourn the passing of a loved one. Every song and every carving carried a piece of wisdom, a lesson, or a memory, passing it from one generation to the next. The people of Europe also began to explore the world beyond their villages. Rivers became highways for boats carrying goods, travelers, and ideas. Forests, once feared, were mapped and tamed, while mountains were climbed and admired for their beauty and challenge. Curiosity became a part of daily life as people asked questions about the sky, the stars, and the mysteries of nature. In the South, powerful civilizations continued to rise. The Greeks debated philosophy, studied the human body, and created beautiful art. Romans expanded their empire, building roads, aqueducts, and cities that stretched across the continent. Their influence would last for centuries, shaping law, culture, and governance in ways that are still visible today. But even outside these empires, life was rich with stories. Farmers, hunters, and craftsmen all had their roles. Every person contributed to the survival and growth of the community, and though they faced dangers, storms, wild animals, and rival tribes, they also experienced joy, laughter, and wonder. The lessons they learned, the stories they told, and the traditions they kept alive were the heart of Europe's history. By now, Europe was a patchwork of communities, tribes, and emerging cities. People were learning more about how to live together, how to share resources, and how to protect each other. Cooperation became as important as courage, and wisdom often mattered more than strength. Trade continued to grow. Villages exchanged food, tools, and ideas. A simple invention in one village could spread to another, making life easier and opening new possibilities. This sharing of knowledge created connections between distant people even before the great empires dominated the land. Religion remained a central part of life. People honored the sun, the moon, and the earth. They believed that spirits watched over their homes, rivers, and forests. Festivals marked the changing seasons, celebrating life, growth, and the cycles of nature. These celebrations were not just joyful. They taught lessons about balance, gratitude, and respect for the world around them. At the same time, some communities began to organize armies and defenses. Conflicts were inevitable, and leaders emerged who could unite people in times of danger. These early leaders were remembered in stories, their bravery and cleverness inspiring generations. Tales of battles, heroism, and wisdom were passed down like treasures, shared around the fire when children's eyes were wide with wonder. Europe in ancient times was a land of contrasts, between wild forests and growing villages, between fear and curiosity, between survival and discovery. Every challenge shaped the people, every triumph strengthened their communities, and slowly, through countless small steps, the seeds of the modern continent were taking root. As Europe continued to grow, people began to leave behind more permanent marks on the land. Stone circles, tombs, and early temples appeared, showing that humans wanted to honor something greater than themselves. These structures were not just functional. They were a way to remember, to connect with the past, and to dream about the future. Communities became more specialized. Some people focused on farming, others on crafting tools, and others on trading. This division of labor made life more efficient and allowed knowledge to expand. A blacksmith could teach his apprentice to shape metal into swords, plows, or jewelry. A potter could pass down techniques for making durable pots that lasted generations. Every skill learned and shared strengthened the bonds between people. Exploration remained a vital part of life. People traveled along rivers and across hills, discovering new lands, new resources, and new ideas. Curiosity was a driving force. It pushed humans to innovate, to take risks, and to connect with others far away. Even in these early times, Europe was not isolated. Ideas traveled with traders, travelers, and storytellers, spreading knowledge across the continent. Life was still hard, though. Winters were long and brutal, and disease could strike without warning. Communities had to rely on each other more than ever. Survival demanded courage, patience, and ingenuity. But these hardships also built resilience. People learned to plan, to store food, and to protect each other. Every challenge faced became a lesson for the next generation. By the end of this ancient era, Europe was no longer just a land of scattered tribes. It had begun to form the foundations of society, cities, trade networks, written stories, and cultural traditions. People were learning to live together in more complex ways, and the world they were building would echo through the centuries to come. As the ancient era came to a close, Europe had transformed in ways no one could have imagined centuries before. Small tribes had grown into villages and early cities. Knowledge, stories, and traditions had been passed down from one generation to the next, shaping the identity of the people. The land itself had been shaped by human hands. Fields were cultivated, forests partially tamed, and rivers became lifelines connecting communities. Roads, even simple paths, carried not only travelers, but ideas, songs, and knowledge that would influence countless generations. Empires were rising in the south. The Greeks had left a mark with philosophy, science, and art. The Romans were expanding their roads, aqueducts, and governance, laying the groundwork for an organized society across vast territories. Even far from the empires, ordinary people, farmers, hunters, craftsmen, continued to shape the heartbeat of Europe with their daily lives, their struggles, and their celebrations. Through all the challenges, through winters, storms, and conflicts, the people of Europe learned resilience, creativity, and cooperation. They learned that survival depended not only on strength, but also on wisdom, curiosity, and community. And so, as one ancient chapter ended, another was beginning. The Europe of villages, tribes, and early cities had set the stage for the rise of empires, the spread of ideas, and the incredible story of a continent that was still discovering itself. The lessons of the past, carried in stories and traditions, would echo through time, guiding the people of Europe into new eras, new challenges, and new adventures. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe entered a time that would later be called the Middle Ages. Life changed in many ways. Cities that had been bustling with trade became quieter, and many people moved to the countryside to farm and survive. Roads that had connected the empire fell into disrepair, and long journeys became dangerous. But even in these uncertain times, communities found ways to endure. Villages formed around castles or monasteries, places that could offer protection and guidance. People learned to rely on each other more than ever. Neighbors shared food, skills, and stories. Life was hard, yes, but it was full of lessons about courage, loyalty, and perseverance. Religion played a central role. Christianity spread across the continent, guiding daily life and shaping society. Churches were not only places of worship, they were centers of learning, art, and culture. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved knowledge from the past, and taught children. The wisdom of the old world survived in their careful hands, ready to be passed down to future generations. Travelers and traders still moved across Europe, bringing goods, ideas, and news from distant lands. Even small villages felt the ripple of distant events. A new invention, a clever farming tool, or a story from far away could transform daily life. Curiosity and creativity survived, quietly shaping the future of Europe. Though wars and conflicts were frequent, ordinary people kept life moving. Farmers tended their fields, blacksmiths shaped metal, and families celebrated the changing seasons. Joy and sorrow existed side by side, just as they always had, teaching each generation to endure, adapt, and hope. Europe in the early Middle Ages was a land of contrasts between decay and renewal, fear and curiosity, struggle and discovery. And slowly, through centuries of daily life, Europe was preparing for the changes that would bring new ideas, new kingdoms, and new adventures. As Europe settled into the early Middle Ages, new kingdoms began to rise. Leaders emerged, uniting tribes and villages under their banners. Some were wise and just, while others ruled with fear and force. Kings and queens shaped laws, defended their lands, and inspired loyalty, or sometimes rebellion. Life for ordinary people was still centered on the land. Farming dictated the rhythm of each year. Planting, harvesting, and storing food were not just tasks. They were survival. Festivals marked the seasons, offering moments of joy and celebration. These gatherings strengthened communities, passing down traditions, stories, and songs from one generation to the next. Trade began to return, slowly at first. Markets appeared in towns, bringing goods from near and far. Spices, cloth, and tools traveled long distances, carried by merchants who braved rivers, forests, and dangerous roads. Along with goods, ideas traveled too, stories, inventions, and knowledge of distant lands. This exchange would slowly help Europe recover the learning and culture that had been lost after Rome's fall. Religion continued to guide life and society. Monasteries and cathedrals were built, serving as centers of learning, art, and faith. Monks and nuns worked tirelessly to preserve books, teach reading, and copy ancient texts. Their quiet work ensured that Europe's past knowledge was not lost, creating a bridge to the future. Even amid hardship, people found ways to celebrate life. Music, dances, and tales were shared in homes and marketplaces. Each story, each song, each tradition carried lessons about bravery, love, loyalty, and hope. Through all the struggles of the Middle Ages, ordinary people kept the spirit of Europe alive, quietly shaping a world that would one day flourish again. By the middle of the Middle Ages, Europe had become a land of castles, knights, and growing towns. Lords and ladies ruled estates, and their castles were centers of power, protection, and sometimes intrigue. Knights trained for years, learning the arts of war, honor, and loyalty. Their stories, told around fires, inspired generations with courage and adventure. Life for most people remained tied to the land, but towns offered new opportunities. Markets thrived with merchants, artisans, and craftsmen. Blacksmiths shaped iron into tools and weapons. Weavers created fine cloth, and bakers filled the streets with the smell of fresh bread. Small towns became hubs of trade, connecting villages and even distant kingdoms. The church remained a guiding force, shaping morals, education, and law. Cathedrals rose high, their spires reaching toward the heavens, filled with carvings, paintings, and stained glass. Monks and scholars kept learning alive, preserving knowledge from the ancient world and discovering new ideas. Pilgrimages brought people together, spreading culture, devotion, and stories across Europe. Yet Europe was not always peaceful. Conflicts between lords, kingdoms, and invading forces were frequent. Life could be uncertain, and communities relied on each other for safety and support. Despite the dangers, people celebrated life whenever they could. Festivals, fairs, and religious feasts broke the monotony of hard labor, reminding everyone of beauty, joy, and connection. Through struggle and survival, Europe's identity began to take shape. Trade, learning, and culture slowly intertwined with traditions, faith, and the strength of ordinary people. The Middle Ages were not just a time of darkness. They were a time of growth, resilience, and the foundation for the Europe that was yet to come. As the Middle Ages progressed, Europe began to change in ways that would shape its future. Towns grew larger, trade routes expanded, and a new middle class of merchants and artisans began to emerge. People had more opportunities to learn trades, start businesses, and influence their communities. The old world of only lords and peasants slowly shifted into something more complex. Education and knowledge began to spread beyond monasteries. Universities appeared in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, where students studied philosophy, law, medicine, and theology. Scholars debated ideas, shared discoveries, and preserved the wisdom of the past while dreaming about the future. Learning became a path to influence, and curiosity sparked a new energy across the continent. Art and culture flourished as well. Cathedrals became not only houses of worship, but also masterpieces of architecture, sculpture, and stained glass. Minstrels and storytellers traveled from town to town, sharing legends and tales that inspired imagination and preserved history. Music, poetry, and visual arts became ways for people to express their hopes, fears, and beliefs. Even as society changed, daily life remained tied to the land for most people. Farmers worked tirelessly to feed their families and communities, enduring harsh winters, floods, and occasional famines. But they also celebrated the seasons, sharing stories, food, and music that strengthened bonds and kept traditions alive. Europe in the later Middle Ages was a land of contrasts, old and new, struggle and celebration, faith and curiosity. These centuries built resilience, knowledge, and culture, preparing the continent for the great transformations that were yet to come. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe was preparing for a new era. The old feudal system still existed, but towns and cities were thriving. Merchants traveled farther than ever before, bringing goods like spices, silks, and metals from distant lands. Trade created wealth and opportunities, slowly changing the social order. The church remained powerful, but its influence began to face challenges. People questioned traditions, and new ideas started to spread. Scholars and thinkers debated science, philosophy, and religion. Curiosity, once limited to monasteries, began to reach wider audiences. Europe was learning to ask questions, not just follow rules. Wars, plagues, and political struggles had shaped life for centuries. The Black Death had taken millions, leaving communities devastated, but also forcing societies to adapt. Labor became more valuable, towns gained independence, and ordinary people began to have a stronger voice. Survival taught resilience, and hardship taught innovation. Art and culture were ready to explode. Gothic cathedrals reached new heights, filled with intricate carvings and colorful stained glass. Music, poetry, and storytelling flourished. Even in hard times, people created beauty, reminding themselves of hope, faith, and imagination. The end of the Middle Ages was not just an ending, it was a beginning. Europe was stepping into a world of exploration, discovery, and transformation. The seeds of the Renaissance, the rise of kingdoms, and the spread of knowledge were already planted, waiting to grow. As the Middle Ages came to a close, Europe was on the brink of great change. Cities had grown larger, trade networks stretched across the continent, and knowledge that had been preserved in monasteries was now spreading through towns and universities. People were beginning to see the world differently. Exploration was in the air. Merchants and travelers brought news, maps, and goods from faraway lands. Ideas from the Islamic world and classical Greece and Rome sparked curiosity in art, science, and philosophy. People began to ask questions. How does the world work? What can we create? How can we understand the past to build a better future? Art and literature reflected this new spirit. Painters, sculptors, and writers experimented with perspective, realism, and human emotion. Stories that once stayed in monasteries or castles now reached wider audiences. The world felt larger, full of possibilities, and Europe was ready to embrace them. Life for ordinary people continued its rhythm of work, family, and community. But now there was more room for creativity, learning, and self-expression. Towns offered new opportunities for craftspeople, merchants, and thinkers. Even peasants were influenced indirectly by the growing exchange of ideas and goods. The end of the Middle Ages was a bridge. It connected centuries of survival, faith, and community with a future of exploration, art, and innovation. Europe had endured hardship, but it had also built the foundations for a world that was curious, ambitious, and ready to grow. The final years of the Middle Ages were a time of endings and beginnings. Old ways of life, shaped by feudal lords, castles, and the rhythms of farming, were giving way to something new. Cities buzzed with trade, ideas flowed along rivers and roads, and curiosity was stirring in the minds of thinkers, artists, and ordinary people alike. Europe had faced wars, plagues, and political upheaval, yet it survived. Communities had learned resilience. People had built, prayed, worked, and celebrated together. The stories, songs, and traditions of generations created a sense of identity and continuity. Even in hardship, hope persisted. Knowledge, once hidden in monasteries, was now spreading through universities, libraries, and manuscripts. Art was reaching new heights, capturing human emotion, beauty, and faith in ways never seen before. Science and philosophy began to challenge old ideas, planting seeds that would blossom in the centuries to come. The Middle Ages were not just a period of darkness, as some would later say. They were a time of growth, adaptation, and preparation. Europe had built the foundation. Its people, culture, and knowledge were ready for the great transformations of the Renaissance. And so, as one chapter closed, another began. The world of castles and knights slowly gave way to a world of exploration, discovery, and creativity. Europe was ready to step forward, carrying the lessons, struggles, and achievements of the Middle Ages into a brighter, more curious future. The Renaissance began in Italy around the 14th century, and it was like Europe had opened a window to a brighter world. After centuries of survival and slow growth, people were ready to explore, create, and dream. Art, science, and ideas began to shine in ways that had never been seen before. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome became centers of culture and learning. Wealthy families, like the Medici in Florence, supported artists, architects, and scholars. They believed in the power of human creativity, and they invested in it. This support allowed painters to bring walls to life with color, sculptors to shape marble into lifelike forms, and writers to explore the depths of human thought. People began to rediscover the works of ancient Greece and Rome. Philosophy, literature, and history were studied not just for tradition, but to understand humanity and the world. Scholars questioned old ideas and explored new ones. Curiosity was celebrated, and learning was seen as a way to improve life. Science also took great steps forward, observing the stars, studying anatomy, and experimenting with nature revealed a world that was both complex and beautiful. The Renaissance was not just about art. It was about seeing the world in a new way, understanding it, and finding the human spirit at the center of it all. Everyday life started to change, too. Towns were bustling with trade, and people had more opportunities to learn, create, and express themselves. Festivals, music, and storytelling reflected a renewed excitement for life. Europe felt alive, curious, and full of possibilities. The Renaissance was Europe's awakening. It was a time when the past and the present met, when human creativity and curiosity began to shape a future that would change the world forever. During the Renaissance, art became more than decoration. It became a way to understand life, humanity, and the world. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo didn't just create beautiful images, they captured emotion, movement, and the complexity of human experience. Sculptors shaped stone into lifelike figures, and architects designed buildings that inspired awe. Patrons Wealthy families and rulers supported this explosion of creativity. They believed that art could reflect their values, faith, and vision. Cities became open galleries, and people could walk through streets filled with masterpieces. Even ordinary citizens could experience beauty and ideas that once belonged only to the elite. Literature flourished too. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio explored human emotions, moral questions, and the beauty of storytelling. They connected people to the past while inspiring imagination for the future. Poetry, plays, and essays became ways to ask big questions. Who are we? How should we live? What is our place in the world? Music also reached new heights. Composers experimented with harmony, melody, and instruments. Churches and courts alike became centers of performance, filling Europe with sound and emotion. People celebrated life, faith, and creativity through song and instrument, and music helped spread ideas across regions. The Renaissance was not just about individual geniuses, it was a shared awakening. Communities, schools, and workshops contributed to a culture where curiosity and skill were celebrated. People began to see that life could be beautiful, thoughtful, and meaningful, and that human potential had no limits. In this way, the Renaissance transformed Europe. It wasn't a sudden change, but a slow and steady illumination. Art, literature, music, and architecture became windows into the human soul, and Europe was ready to step into an age of exploration, discovery, and innovation. The Renaissance was not just about beautiful paintings and music. It was also a time when people started to look at the world in a new way. Scholars and thinkers began to ask questions about nature, the stars, and the human body. They wanted to understand how things worked, not just accept old explanations. Astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo looked at the skies and realized that Earth was not the center of the universe. This was a shocking idea at the time, but it opened the door to a new understanding of the cosmos. People began to see that observation and evidence could change what they thought they knew. Medicine and anatomy advanced as well. Doctors and scientists studied the human body in detail, learning how it functioned and how to treat illnesses more effectively. Knowledge that had been hidden or misunderstood for centuries was now being uncovered. Philosophers and thinkers also explored new ideas about humanity, society, and knowledge. Humanism became popular. It focused on human potential, creativity, and reason. People started to believe that education, experience, and curiosity could shape their lives and the world around them. Technology advanced too. Printing presses allowed books to be made faster and cheaper, spreading ideas across Europe. Suddenly, knowledge was not limited to a few scholars in distant cities. It was available to anyone who could read. Communities shared learning, and people debated, discussed, and discovered together. The Renaissance was a time of awakening for the mind. Curiosity, observation, and imagination became powerful tools. Europe was learning to question, explore, and innovate, laying the foundation for the modern world. During the Renaissance, Europe's curiosity wasn't limited to art or science. It reached the oceans. Sailors, navigators, and explorers set out to discover new lands, trade routes, and cultures. The world was bigger than anyone had imagined, and Europe wanted to see it. Figures like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan became famous for their daring voyages. They crossed oceans, mapped unknown coasts, and connected continents. These journeys brought new goods, ideas, and knowledge back to Europe, but they also changed the lives of people far away, sometimes in difficult ways. trade expanded enormously. Spices, silk, gold, and other treasures traveled from Asia, Africa, and the Americas to European markets. Cities that had been centers of local trade now became hubs in global networks. Merchants and bankers gained wealth and influence, and European culture absorbed new ideas, foods, and techniques. Exploration also inspired imagination. Maps, travel stories, and accounts of distant lands fascinated people. Artists, writers, and scientists learned from these new discoveries, blending knowledge from different parts of the world. Europe was no longer isolated. It was part of a connected, changing world. Yet exploration was complex. It brought curiosity and learning, but also conflict and exploitation. European powers began to compete for land, resources, and influence, and indigenous peoples often suffered. The Renaissance spirit of discovery carried both wonder and responsibility. This era of exploration showed that curiosity and courage could expand human understanding. The world seemed bigger, more diverse, and full of possibilities. Europe's Renaissance was now not just a cultural awakening, but a global one, setting the stage for centuries of change, trade, and adventure. The Renaissance left a mark that would last for centuries. It was more than a period of beautiful art or impressive buildings. It changed how people thought, learned, and imagined the world. One of the greatest legacies was humanism. People learned to value creativity, reason, and curiosity. They saw that each person had potential and that knowledge and experience could shape life and society. Education became more important, and learning was celebrated as a way to improve both the self and the community. Art, literature, and music continued to inspire generations. Techniques, ideas, and styles from the Renaissance influenced artists and thinkers long after the period ended. People had learned to observe the world closely, to capture emotion, and to express ideas in ways that spoke to the human spirit. Science and exploration also left a permanent mark. Observation, experimentation, and discovery became central to European thought. The Renaissance encouraged questioning old beliefs, seeking evidence, and exploring the unknown. These values paved the way for the scientific revolution and the modern understanding of the world. Even everyday life felt the change. Trade, cities, and social mobility grew. People had more access to books, ideas, and knowledge than ever before. Curiosity and innovation were celebrated, and communities began to connect more widely, both within Europe and across the globe. The Renaissance taught Europe to dream bigger, to value human potential, and to look beyond the familiar. It was a bridge between the medieval past and the modern world, a time when curiosity, creativity, and courage transformed society and set the stage for centuries of change and growth. By the early 16th century, Europe was ready for change again. The Renaissance had opened minds, but the Church, which had been central to life for centuries, faced criticism. People began to question its authority, practices, and the gap between its teachings and actions. One man, Martin Luther, became the spark. A German monk and scholar, Luther saw corruption in the Church and believed that faith and personal connection to God were more important than rituals or indulgences. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, challenging the Church to reform. This simple act ignited debates across Europe. Printing presses helped spread Luther's ideas quickly. People read his writings and started to question old practices. Many agreed with him, believing that the Church needed to return to its spiritual roots. Others resisted, and Europe began to divide. The Reformation wasn't just about religion. It affected politics, society, and culture. Kings, princes, and city leaders took sides, and new Protestant churches emerged. Communities had to navigate conflicts, choices, and sometimes violence as the old order was challenged and new ideas spread. Luther's message emphasized personal faith, reading the Bible, and understanding one's own beliefs. People learned that religion could be more personal and direct, rather than controlled solely by priests or authorities. This idea would have lasting effects on European society, education, and governance. The Reformation showed that change often starts with questioning the familiar, and that courage and conviction can reshape the lives of millions. Europe was entering a period of transformation that would affect every corner of life, from faith to politics to daily routines. After Martin Luther's challenge, new Protestant movements began to spread across Europe. People in different regions started forming their own churches, each interpreting the Bible and faith in their own way. Leaders like John Calvin in Switzerland and Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich introduced ideas about discipline, morality, and how communities should live according to God's Word. These movements inspired devotion, education, and reform, but they also caused conflict. Catholic rulers resisted the changes, fearing that breaking from the church would weaken their authority. Meanwhile, Protestant rulers and cities defended their new beliefs, sometimes leading to wars, political struggles, and social tension. In England, the Reformation took a unique path. King Henry VIII broke with the Pope and established the Church of England, mainly for political reasons, but it still brought ideas of Protestant reform to the population. People began to experience religion in new ways, combining faith, politics, and personal conviction. Despite the conflicts, the Reformation encouraged literacy and learning. Reading the Bible in local languages became essential. Schools and universities grew, and ordinary people began to explore spiritual ideas for themselves. Religion was no longer controlled entirely by distant authorities. It was personal, local, and sometimes revolutionary. The Reformation also reshaped Europe's map. Borders, alliances, and governments were influenced by faith. Communities had to navigate new laws, new churches, and new ways of living together. People learned that belief could unite them, but differences could also divide them. In the end, the Reformation showed that ideas have power. One person's courage, combined with new technology and growing curiosity, could change the course of history. Europe was entering a world where questioning tradition could lead to both discovery and challenge, and society was forever transformed. As Protestant ideas spread, the Catholic Church knew it had to respond. This period is called the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation. The Church wanted to reform itself, clarify its teachings, and stop the spread of Protestantism. One of the most important events was the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. Church leaders gathered to examine practices, correct abuses, and reinforce core beliefs. They emphasized faith, good works, and the authority of the Church, while also improving education for priests and combating corruption. New religious orders emerged, like the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. Jesuits focused on education, missions, and spreading Catholic faith worldwide. They built schools, universities, and traveled to distant lands to teach and convert. Their work strengthened Catholic communities and inspired devotion. Art and culture played a role too. The Church used painting, sculpture, and music to inspire faith and devotion. Baroque art, with its dramatic and emotional style, encouraged people to feel the power and glory of God. Religion and creativity intertwined, showing that faith could be expressed not only in words, but also in experience and emotion. The Counter-Reformation led to both renewal and conflict. Wars broke out between Catholic and Protestant regions, reshaping politics and society. Religious identity became linked with national and political identity, and Europe's map changed as a result. Ultimately, the Catholic Reformation strengthened the Church, clarified its teachings, and renewed spiritual life. It showed that institutions could adapt, respond to challenges, and inspire people, even in times of great change and tension. The Reformation changed Europe in ways that lasted for centuries. Religion was no longer just about rituals and church hierarchy. It became personal, local, and tied to individual conscience. People began to think for themselves, read, and interpret the Bible on their own, which encouraged literacy and education everywhere. Politics and power were deeply affected. Kings and princes realized that religious belief could unite or divide people, and they used it to strengthen their own rule. Countries and regions became more distinct in their faith, which sometimes led to wars, treaties, and shifting borders. Europe had to learn how to live with diversity in belief, a challenge that shaped governments and societies. Culture and society were transformed too. Protestant and Catholic communities both encouraged schools, universities, and scholarship. Art, literature, and music flourished as a way to express faith and values. People began to see that ideas, learning, and culture were central to life, not just wealth or power. The Reformation also set the stage for future change. It paved the way for the Enlightenment, scientific inquiry, and the modern idea of individual rights. By questioning authority and exploring new ways of thinking, Europeans learned that change was possible, even when tradition seemed unbreakable. In the end, the Reformation reminds us that ideas matter. One monk's courage, combined with new technologies and the curiosity of ordinary people, reshaped Europe forever. Faith, learning, and conscience became tools not just for spiritual life, but for shaping society, politics, and culture for generations to come. By the late 15th century, Europe was filled with curiosity. People wanted to know more about the world, its lands, its peoples, and its treasures. Trade had grown, cities were thriving, and powerful kingdoms had the wealth to fund bold journeys. Explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan set out to find new routes across the oceans. They faced storms, unknown lands, and great danger, but they were driven by curiosity, ambition, and sometimes the promise of wealth. Maps improved, ships became stronger, and navigational tools allowed sailors to venture further than ever before. Every voyage brought new knowledge about the world, coastlines, winds, currents, and distant cultures. Europe began to see the globe as a connected place, not just distant lands separated by the unknown. Exploration wasn't just about discovery, it changed trade, economy, and society. Spices, gold, silver, and new crops traveled back to Europe, transforming diets, wealth, and industries. People's understanding of the world expanded, and the European imagination grew wilder and more ambitious. But exploration also had a darker side. Indigenous peoples faced conquest, disease, and exploitation. The new connections of the world brought both opportunity and suffering, teaching Europe and the world lessons about power, curiosity, and responsibility. The age of exploration shows how human courage and curiosity can reshape the world. Every voyage was a story of risk, discovery, and the excitement of seeing the unknown for the first time. Europe was no longer a small continent. It was part of a vast, interconnected world full of possibilities and challenges. As explorers returned with tales of new lands and riches, European kingdoms began to establish empires. Spain and Portugal were first, claiming vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Soon, England, France, and the Netherlands joined, setting up colonies, trading posts, and forts around the world. Colonization changed lives for both Europeans and the people in the lands they settled. Europeans introduced new crops, animals, and technologies, but they also brought diseases, forced labor, and conflict. Entire societies were reshaped, sometimes destroyed, by the arrival of foreign powers. Trade grew rapidly. Spices from Asia, silver from the Americas, and sugar from the Caribbean traveled across oceans. Merchants and investors became powerful, and cities in Europe flourished. The economy became more global, and people began to see that wealth and power were now tied to the farthest corners of the earth. Colonial empires also brought culture, religion, and ideas to new lands. Missionaries spread Christianity, while European languages, laws, and customs took root in distant regions. At the same time, explorers and settlers learned from indigenous peoples, adopting crops, tools, and knowledge that helped them survive and thrive. Yet, this age was not without conflict. Rivalries between empires often led to wars, both in Europe and overseas. Colonies became battlegrounds for European ambitions, and ordinary people, both colonizers and indigenous communities, faced the consequences. The age of exploration reminds us that curiosity, ambition, and the desire for wealth can reshape the world. It brought discovery, connection, and progress, but also conflict, suffering, and responsibility. Europe was no longer isolated. It was a central player in a vast, interconnected global story. Exploration didn't just bring wealth, it changed the way people thought. Europeans discovered new plants, animals, and foods, like potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa. These new crops transformed diets in Europe, leading to population growth and changing farming practices. Knowledge about the world expanded. Maps became more accurate, and geographers, astronomers, and navigators shared discoveries across continents. People began to see Earth as a globe with continents connected by oceans. The curiosity sparked by exploration also fueled science, encouraging people to observe, measure, and understand nature. Culture changed too. Stories of distant lands, peoples, and adventures fascinated Europeans. Writers, artists, and scholars incorporated new ideas into their work. Literature, painting, and music reflected the excitement, danger, and wonder of the unknown world. Religious and philosophical ideas also traveled. Missionaries brought Christianity to new lands, while Europeans encountered different beliefs, traditions, and ways of life. This exchange challenged old assumptions and slowly encouraged thinking about humanity, culture, and morality in broader terms. The age of exploration left a lasting legacy. It connected continents, inspired knowledge, and reshaped societies. It showed that curiosity and courage could change the world, but also that exploration carried responsibility. The world felt both larger and more connected, opening doors for trade, ideas, and human interaction on an unprecedented scale. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe began to see the world in a new way. People started asking questions about nature, the universe, and the human body. Instead of relying only on tradition or authority, scientists began to observe, experiment, and think critically. This period is called the Scientific Revolution. Key figures like Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, and Isaac Newton changed how people understood the universe. Copernicus suggested that the Earth and planets revolve around the sun, challenging long-held beliefs. Galileo used telescopes to observe the stars and planets, proving that careful observation could reveal truths about nature. Newton formulated laws of motion and gravity, explaining how objects move both on Earth and in space. This new approach emphasized evidence and reason. People learned to test ideas, gather data, and question assumptions. Science became a way to understand the world systematically, not just philosophically or theologically. The scientific revolution affected more than astronomy and physics. It influenced medicine, biology, chemistry, and even navigation. New discoveries improved health, travel, and industry, and they inspired Europeans to explore, innovate, and imagine a world governed by natural laws rather than only by tradition or superstition. At its heart, the scientific revolution was about curiosity and courage. It taught people to look at the world carefully, think critically, and embrace the idea that knowledge could change life. Europe was entering an age where ideas mattered as much as power, wealth, or faith. One of the most important lessons of the scientific revolution was the scientific method. Instead of guessing or relying only on tradition, thinkers began to observe carefully, form hypotheses, test them through experiments, and draw conclusions. This method allowed discoveries to be verified and shared, building knowledge step by step. Francis Bacon and René Descartes were key figures who promoted systematic thinking. Bacon emphasized observation and experimentation, while Descartes focused on reason and logic. Together, they encouraged a way of thinking that combined curiosity, evidence, and careful reasoning. Innovation flourished as a result. New instruments like telescopes, microscopes, and barometers allowed scientists to explore things invisible to the naked eye. Medicine advanced as people studied anatomy and the human body more precisely. Chemistry developed with careful experiments, leading to a better understanding of substances and reactions. The revolution in science also affected society. Education, universities, and academies expanded, spreading new ideas. Governments began supporting research, understanding that knowledge could lead to power, wealth, and progress. Most importantly, the scientific revolution changed how people thought. It encouraged questioning, critical thinking, and the belief that the world could be understood through observation and reason. It set the stage for the Enlightenment, where knowledge and reason would influence politics, philosophy, and everyday life. The message was clear. By looking closely, thinking carefully, and daring to question, humans could unlock the secrets of the universe. Europe, and eventually the world, was entering a new age of knowledge and possibility. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe was buzzing with ideas. People were asking questions not just about nature, but about society, government, and human rights. This period is called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. Thinkers believed that reason, logic, and evidence could improve the world. Philosophers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu challenged old traditions. They argued that humans had natural rights, that governments should serve the people, and that tolerance and freedom of thought were essential for society. These ideas were revolutionary. They suggested that people, not kings or religious authorities, could shape their own destiny. Science and philosophy continued to advance together. People applied reason to economics, law, and education. Encyclopedias collected and shared knowledge, making it accessible to more people. Literature, art, and music reflected new ideas, celebrating individuality, progress, and human potential. The Enlightenment spread through salons, books, and newspapers, reaching not only elites, but also merchants, artisans, and even ordinary citizens. Ideas about equality, justice, and liberty began to take root in minds across Europe. At its heart, the Enlightenment was about hope and possibility. It taught that by thinking critically and questioning authority, humans could understand the world and improve society. The stage was set for revolutions, political, social, and intellectual, that would reshape Europe and the world in the centuries to come. The ideas of the Enlightenment didn't stay in books. They changed the way people thought about government and society. Philosophers argued that rulers should be accountable, that laws should be fair, and that people had rights simply because they were human. John Locke introduced the idea of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. He believed that governments exist to protect these rights, and if they failed, people could challenge them. Montesquieu wrote about the separation of powers, suggesting that governments should have different branches to prevent abuse. Jean-Jacques Rousseau emphasized that society should be based on a social contract, where people collectively decide the rules that govern them. These ideas inspired revolutions. The American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789 were directly influenced by Enlightenment thinking. People demanded equality, freedom, and representation. Monarchies and old traditions were challenged, sometimes violently, but always with the hope of building fairer societies. Enlightenment ideas also shaped social life and culture. Education expanded, and literacy grew as people sought knowledge. Debates, newspapers, and pamphlets spread ideas quickly. Even ordinary citizens began to question authority, think critically, and imagine a society where reason guided decision-making. The Enlightenment showed that ideas could be powerful. They could inspire change, challenge the old order, and open minds to new possibilities. Europe was no longer just a continent of kings and peasants. It had become a continent of thinkers, dreamers, and reformers, ready to shape a new world. By the late 18th century, Europe was changing in ways people had never imagined. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain and soon spread across the continent. Machines started to do work that humans and animals once did, and this transformed everyday life, work, and society. Factories replaced small workshops. People moved from farms to cities to work in textile mills, iron foundries, and coal mines. Steam engines powered machines, trains, and ships, connecting towns and countries like never before. The speed and scale of production increased, making goods cheaper and more available. This revolution brought wealth, but it also created challenges. Cities grew quickly, often without proper housing, sanitation, or safety. Workers faced long hours and dangerous conditions. At the same time, new inventions like the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and mechanized looms made life more efficient and opened doors to innovation. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change work, it changed thinking. People began to see the world in terms of progress and possibility. Technology and human ingenuity could solve problems and improve lives. The era emphasized invention, experimentation, and the belief that humans could reshape their environment to suit their needs. The Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of a modern world. Europe was no longer a continent of mostly rural villages. It was becoming urban, industrial, and interconnected, with new opportunities, challenges, and ideas shaping its future. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring machines, it reshaped society. People moved to cities in huge numbers, searching for work in factories. Crowded neighborhoods, poor sanitation, and long workdays were common. Life was often hard, especially for children who sometimes worked in dangerous conditions. But the Industrial Revolution also created new opportunities. Wages, though low at first, allowed some families to improve their living standards over time. Cities became centers of commerce, education, and culture. New professions appeared, from engineers and inventors to clerks and managers. Economically, Europe transformed. Trade expanded, banking grew, and industries multiplied. Coal, iron, and textiles became powerful engines of growth. The Industrial Revolution also fueled innovation. New machinery, transportation, and communication changed how people lived and connected. Socially, ideas about labor, rights, and education began to shift. Movements emerged advocating for workers' rights, child labor laws, and universal education. People began to realize that progress wasn't just about machines, it was about improving human lives alongside industry. The Industrial Revolution showed that change was unstoppable. It brought both promise and struggle, but it taught Europe an essential lesson. Innovation could reshape the world, and society had to adapt to keep pace. Cities, work, and daily life would never be the same again. In the 19th century, Europe experienced a new kind of energy, nationalism. People began to feel a strong connection to their language, culture, and history. They no longer identified only with a king or a local town. They imagined a community called a nation, united by shared traditions and values. Nationalism inspired both unity and conflict. In some regions, it brought people together to form new countries. For example, Italy and Germany were made up of smaller states that joined to become unified nations. Leaders like Giuseppe Garibaldi in Italy and Otto von Bismarck in Germany used politics, diplomacy, and even war to unite their people under one national identity. At the same time, nationalism could divide. Empires with diverse populations, like Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire, faced tension as different ethnic groups sought independence. The idea that people had the right to govern themselves sometimes clashed with traditional monarchies and established borders. Nationalism also fueled pride and cultural revival. Languages, literature, music, and traditions were celebrated. People began to write histories, collect folklore, and honor national heroes. It was a time when identity and pride became powerful forces shaping politics, society, and everyday life. Europe was learning an important lesson. Ideas could unite nations, but they could also challenge empires. Nationalism would play a huge role in shaping the continent's future, leading to both progress and conflict in the decades to come. Nationalism didn't just stay in people's hearts, it shaped governments and politics. Across Europe, citizens began to demand representation, rights, and the ability to influence how they were ruled. Monarchies and empires faced pressure as people wanted governments that reflected their identity and values. In Italy and Germany, nationalist movements succeeded in creating unified states. These new nations had stronger economies, organized armies, and clearer national identities. In other areas, however, nationalism caused tension. Ethnic groups under empires, such as the Austrians, Ottomans, and Russians, pushed for autonomy. Conflicts, uprisings, and reforms became common as empires struggled to manage diverse populations. Nationalism also influenced foreign policy and alliances. Countries sought to expand or protect their borders, sometimes leading to wars. Leaders understood that a strong national identity could unite people in support of political and military goals. At the same time, nationalism inspired social movements, education reforms, and cultural revival, reinforcing the bond between citizens and their nation. By the late 19th century, Europe had become a patchwork of new nations, empires under strain, and societies driven by identity. Nationalism was a powerful force that could both inspire unity and spark conflict, setting the stage for the major political upheavals of the 20th century. By the late 19th century, European nations were looking beyond their borders. Industrial growth, new technologies, and competition for resources fueled a rush to claim territories across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This period is known as the Age of Imperialism. Countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium expanded their empires, establishing colonies that supplied raw materials for industry and new markets for goods. Steamships, telegraphs, and railways made it easier to control faraway lands. European powers argued that they were bringing civilization and progress, though local populations often suffered from exploitation, displacement, and oppression. Imperialism also had a strategic and political dimension. Nations competed for influence, ports, and trade routes. Rivalries sometimes led to conflicts, creating tensions that would later contribute to global wars. At the same time, explorers, missionaries, and entrepreneurs spread European culture, languages, and institutions across the world. Despite the hardships for colonized peoples, imperialism reshaped the global economy and political map. European nations grew wealthier and more powerful, while their influence reached almost every continent. It was a time of ambition, innovation, and profound inequality, an era that would leave a lasting mark on the 20th century. Imperialism didn't just change borders, it reshaped lives and cultures. In colonies, traditional ways of life were often disrupted. European powers introduced new systems of education, religion, and governance. While some people gained access to schools, hospitals, and technology, many others faced loss of land, forced labor, and cultural suppression. Colonial societies became a mix of local traditions and foreign influence. Languages, clothing, and customs blended, creating complex identities. In some regions, resistance movements emerged as people sought to preserve their heritage and challenge foreign control. Back in Europe, imperialism influenced culture and society as well. People read about faraway lands, exotic goods arrived in markets, and governments celebrated their national achievements. Newspapers and novels often portrayed colonies as places of adventure, discovery, and opportunity, shaping public opinion about the empire. The age of imperialism demonstrated the power and reach of European nations, but it also highlighted inequalities and tensions. Colonized peoples struggled to maintain their identity, while Europe grew richer and more interconnected with the world. The consequences of this era would echo through the 20th century, influencing politics, culture, and international relations. By the early 20th century, Europe was a powder keg. Nationalism, imperial rivalries, military alliances, and arms buildup had created tensions across the continent. Countries were competing for colonies, influence, and prestige, while citizens felt pride and loyalty to their nations. The spark came in 1914 when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated. This event triggered a chain reaction of alliances and declarations of war. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Britain joined to protect Belgium. Soon, almost all of Europe was engulfed in conflict. World War I introduced modern industrialized warfare. Trenches stretched for miles, and new weapons like machine guns, tanks, and chemical gases caused unprecedented destruction. Millions of soldiers and civilians suffered, and entire regions were devastated. Despite the horrors, the war also spurred technological and social changes. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and economies were reorganized for total war. Nations realized that modern conflict affected every aspect of society, not just armies on the battlefield. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Europe was a very different place. The war had left millions dead, economies shattered, and societies deeply scarred. Entire cities and regions had been destroyed, and soldiers returned home carrying both physical and emotional wounds. The political map of Europe was redrawn. Empires like Austria-Hungary, Ottoman, Russian, and German were dismantled, giving rise to new nations such as Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland. Borders changed, and new governments struggled to maintain stability in a world still reeling from conflict. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 officially ended the war, but it left many nations dissatisfied. Germany faced harsh penalties, including reparations and territorial losses. Many historians see this treaty as planting the seeds for future conflicts, as grievances lingered and resentment grew. After World War I, Europe was a place of rebuilding and uncertainty. Economies were struggling, governments were weak, and people were searching for stability. The Great Depression of the 1930s made things worse, causing massive unemployment and social unrest. In this climate, totalitarian leaders gained power by promising order, national pride, and economic recovery. Figures like Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany used propaganda, rallies, and charismatic speeches to unite their countries under strong, centralized rule. People were drawn to their promises, hoping for stability after years of hardship. Meanwhile, democracies like France and Britain tried to maintain parliamentary systems, but political divisions and economic struggles made decision-making slow and often ineffective. Citizens watched as extremist movements gained influence, reshaping politics and society across the continent. Even amid political turmoil and economic hardship, European culture flourished in the interwar years. Cities became centers of innovation, where artists, writers, and thinkers experimented with new ideas. Movements like Surrealism, Dadaism, and Modernism challenged traditional norms, reflecting the uncertainty and disillusionment of the time. In literature, authors like Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf explored themes of alienation, loss, and the fragility of human life. Cinema also grew as a popular form of entertainment and storytelling, bringing people together even as economies struggled. Socially, the war had changed the roles of women. Many had worked in factories and offices during World War I, and after the war, they sought greater rights and independence. Youth culture also evolved, with jazz, dancing, and sports creating new forms of leisure and identity. Despite the energy and creativity, underlying tensions remained. Economic instability, political extremism, and unresolved grievances from World War I created a sense of precariousness. Europe was vibrant, innovative, and yet fragile, poised on the edge of events that would soon lead to another catastrophic conflict. By the late 1930s, Europe was again facing tension and instability. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated and economically strained. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party promised to restore pride, reclaim lost territories, and build a strong, unified Germany. Meanwhile, Italy under Mussolini sought to expand its empire, and Japan pursued aggression in Asia. Democratic nations like Britain and France were wary of conflict, often trying to appease dictators in hopes of avoiding another war. Hitler's invasions of Austria and Czechoslovakia showed the world that appeasement would not stop his ambitions. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain and France declared war, officially starting World War II. This time, the scale of conflict would surpass anything Europe had seen before. At the start of the war, Germany used a new strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks, planes, and troops moved quickly, overwhelming enemies before they could organize a proper defense. Countries like Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France fell rapidly to German forces. In the air, the Battle of Britain showed the resilience of civilians and pilots. British cities endured constant bombing, but the determination of ordinary people helped the nation resist total conquest. Meanwhile, Germany turned its attention eastward, preparing for a massive campaign against the Soviet Union. World War II was not just a military conflict, it was total war. Civilians were affected by rationing, bombings, and forced labor. Families were separated, and entire communities lived in fear of occupation. Technology, industry, and propaganda became crucial tools, shaping the experiences of both soldiers and civilians. By 1942 to 1943, the tide of war began to shift. In the East, the Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resistance. German forces, once unstoppable, were encircled and eventually forced to surrender. The Soviet Union started pushing westward, reclaiming lost territory. In the West, the Allies prepared for a massive invasion. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies established a foothold in France, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Meanwhile, battles in North Africa and Italy weakened Axis control, showing that Germany and its allies were not invincible. These turning points gave hope to millions of civilians living under occupation, and morale among the Allies rose. World War II showed the world that cooperation, strategy, and resilience could eventually overcome even the most powerful aggressors. But the cost was immense. Millions of lives lost, cities destroyed, and societies traumatized. By 1945, the Allies were closing in on Germany from the east and west. Cities like Berlin were under siege, and Adolf Hitler's regime collapsed. In May, Germany surrendered, marking the end of war in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, fierce battles continued until the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, forcing Japan to surrender. The aftermath of World War II left Europe and Asia in devastation. Millions were dead, millions more were displaced, and cities lay in ruins. The war also revealed the horrors of the Holocaust, in which millions of Jews and other minorities were systematically murdered. Humanity faced the urgent need to rebuild, remember, and prevent future atrocities. Politically, Europe changed forever. Germany and Japan were occupied and rebuilt, while the United Nations was created to promote peace and cooperation. The seeds of the Cold War were planted as the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as global superpowers, each seeking influence in a divided world. Socially and culturally, survivors grappled with trauma, loss, and the challenge of rebuilding communities. Technology and industry, however, had advanced rapidly, laying the groundwork for the modern age. The lessons of World War II were clear. Unchecked aggression, hatred, and totalitarianism could destroy nations, but resilience, cooperation, and justice offered a path to recovery. After the devastation of World War II, Europe faced an enormous task: rebuilding homes, cities, and economies. Countries were shattered, infrastructure destroyed, and millions of people were displaced. The Marshall Plan, introduced by the United States, provided crucial financial aid to help Western Europe recover. Factories were rebuilt, transportation networks restored, and trade resumed, slowly bringing stability to the continent. Socially, families struggled to reunite, communities to rebuild trust, and societies to cope with the trauma of war. Education, healthcare, and housing became priorities as nations sought to create better futures for their citizens. Politically, new alliances emerged. Western European countries cooperated more closely, leading eventually to the foundation of what would become the European Union. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe came under Soviet influence, marking the start of the Cold War. Europe was divided between two spheres of influence, each with its own ideology, economy, and political system. After World War II, Europe was split into two main spheres of influence. In the West, countries like Britain, France, and West Germany aligned with the United States, promoting democracy, market economies, and individual freedoms. In the East, the Soviet Union established control over countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, creating communist regimes and centralizing power. Tensions between East and West grew. The threat of nuclear weapons, espionage, and propaganda shaped daily life. Events like the Berlin blockade and Berlin airlift showed that even small cities could become flashpoints in a global struggle. Citizens lived with the constant fear of conflict, while governments navigated a delicate balance of diplomacy and deterrence. Culturally, East and West diverged. Western Europe embraced consumerism, innovation, and popular culture, while Eastern Europe emphasized collective ideology, central planning, and state-controlled media. Despite these differences, Europeans found ways to adapt, resist, and innovate, keeping the continent alive with creativity and hope even under political pressure. After the hardships of war and the tension of the Cold War, many European leaders realized that cooperation was the key to peace. Countries that had once fought each other began to work together, starting with economic agreements. In 1951, 6 countries, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany, formed the European Coal and Steel Community, managing crucial industries collectively to reduce the chance of future wars. Over time, cooperation expanded into trade, politics, and culture. The 1957 Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community, which later evolved into the European Union. Borders remained, but goods, services, and people began moving more freely. European citizens could study, work, and travel across countries with new ease, fostering a sense of shared identity. Integration was not simple. Countries debated sovereignty, economics, and politics. Yet, step by step, Europe became more united, showing that Even after centuries of conflict, collaboration, and shared vision could reshape a continent. By the 1970s and 1980s, Europe faced new challenges. Economies struggled with inflation and unemployment, while social movements demanded rights, equality, and environmental protection. The Cold War continued to dominate politics, keeping the continent divided between East and West. In the East, communist regimes faced increasing unrest. People longed for freedom, access to information, and better living conditions. The 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall became a symbol of hope, signaling the collapse of oppressive regimes across Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary transitioned toward democracy and market economies, though the process was often complicated and uneven. In the West, technological progress and globalization brought growth but also challenges. Cities modernized, industries evolved, and European nations worked together to strengthen cooperation through the European Union. Immigration, cultural exchange, and political debates reshaped societies as Europeans adapted to a rapidly changing world. By the end of the 20th century, Europe had recovered from war, endured division, and embraced unity, yet it faced ongoing challenges. History showed that resilience, collaboration, and vision were essential for building a future that could balance tradition, progress, and peace. As Europe entered the 21st century, it faced a mix of opportunities and challenges. Technology and globalization connected countries more than ever. People could communicate, trade, and travel across the continent with unprecedented ease. Cities grew, innovation thrived, and education and healthcare improved for millions. Yet challenges remained. Economic crises, such as the 2008 financial crash, tested governments, businesses, and families. Unemployment, inequality, and migration created political and social debates. Climate change emerged as a pressing concern, urging European nations to balance industrial growth with environmental responsibility. Politically, the European Union expanded, welcoming new members from Eastern Europe. This created opportunities for cooperation, but also sparked debates about sovereignty, immigration, and national identity. Citizens faced questions about how to balance unity with diversity, tradition with progress, and national pride with shared European identity. Despite the challenges, Europe showed resilience. Communities worked together to address crises, innovate in science and technology, and create a more connected continent. The 21st century became a story of adaptation, cooperation, and the ongoing effort to build a better future. In the 21st century, Europe experienced profound social and cultural changes. Migration brought diverse peoples, languages, and traditions to cities and towns, creating vibrant communities. People learned from each other, blending customs, foods, music, and art. This diversity became both a source of strength and challenge as societies worked to foster inclusion and understanding. Education and technology reshaped daily life. Students could study across borders and families connected digitally, shrinking distances between countries. Social media changed how people shared ideas, mobilized for causes, and expressed their identities. Cultural movements emphasized human rights, gender equality, and environmental awareness. Europeans debated values and priorities, balancing modernity with tradition. Arts, literature, and media reflected these transformations, capturing the hopes, struggles, and dreams of everyday people. Even as challenges persisted, like political disagreements or economic inequality, Europe remained a place of resilience and creativity, where individuals and communities continuously adapted to a fast-changing world. In today's world, Europe plays a complex role on the global stage. Economically, it remains one of the largest trading regions, influencing markets, technology, and industry worldwide. Countries collaborate through the European Union to set standards, negotiate trade deals, and respond to global crises. Politically, Europe faces challenges in balance in national interests and collective action. Decisions about security, immigration, and foreign policy often require careful negotiation between member states. Organizations like NATO and partnerships with the United States help maintain peace and stability, while Europe also seeks to address conflicts through diplomacy and humanitarian aid. Security issues, including cyber threats, terrorism, and regional conflicts, remind Europeans that peace is never guaranteed. At the same time, Europe works to promote human rights, democracy, and sustainable development beyond its borders, reflecting a commitment to global responsibility. Despite challenges, Europe's story in the 21st century is one of engagement, adaptation, and hope, a continent learning to navigate a rapidly changing world while staying connected to its long history and shared values. Looking back at Europe's long and often turbulent history, we see a continent that has endured wars, revolutions, and social upheavals, yet continuously adapted. From the fall of empires to the rise of democracies, from devastation to reconstruction, Europe's story is one of resilience, creativity, and cooperation. Today, Europe faces new questions. How can nations preserve their identities while working together? How can economic growth and technological progress coexist with fairness and sustainability? How can people from diverse backgrounds live together in harmony? The future is uncertain, but history teaches a valuable lesson. Collaboration, dialogue, and vision can overcome challenges. Just as past generations rebuilt cities, economies, and societies after conflict, today's Europeans continue to shape a continent that values peace, innovation, and shared humanity. In the end, Europe's journey is ongoing, a living story written by millions of individuals, families, and communities. And as with any long story, the next chapters depend on the choices, courage, and creativity of those who live them.